dogs are trained that when they identify a scent, they recognize a scent, they sit. There has been some work where the dog will actually sort of point his nose into the specific area that he thinks that the strongest odor is coming from. So if you're looking at, a bookshelf, and he's on the third shelf and that's where the device is, he would find it on the third shelf or nose towards it. With drug dogs, they're trained to react differently. They're trained to start pouring at it and try and rip it apart and dig it out. And that becomes really problematic, right? If you have a device, you have an explosive device, the last thing you want to do is the last thing you want to have done is have the dog start smacking it all over the place.
Welcome to the riskadvisor.com podcast. I am Jim Henry and here with my good friend and co-host, Sal and. Before we begin, I'd like to remind each of you to subscribe to this show and push the like button for us. And please leave comments as your opinion is important to us. Today's topic is man's best friend, explosive canine detection. Otherwise affectionately known to me as MSUs, mobile security units. You can't top them. So, Sal, this is a subject that you know quite a bit about, having provided bomb detection dogs, and now the use for our four-legged friends appears to be expanding significantly with discussion of many other applications that their very accurate noses can be put to. So why don't you talk a little bit about your experience there?
Just kind of kick it off a bit. Yeah, I think, one of the things that I think COVID has done is sort of, reduced or given the perception of the reduced need for explosive detection canines. We've seen with everything going on, people aren't going to work, training systems aren't being used as much, travel isn't being used as much. People that were utilizing canine services at facilities, stadiums, or we're utilizing them, and we don't have games anymore, right? We're just starting to get back into that now. So a lot of it just kind of floated away, just kind of went away. But I think what we're seeing domestically, what we're seeing with domestic terrorism, becoming what it is, and to the degree that it's being known, I think you look at some of the attack methodologies that they've utilized. I think it becomes something sort of important now for us to get it back into thinking about canine operations and how do you deploy them. And there's not a whole lot of information. People see the dogs and they go, oh, yeah, that's a bomb dog, that's a drug dog, and they kind of go with that. But I thought it was kind of important if we would do a show that talked about, let's do a little bit behind the scenes on Canine, what it's about, how do they operate, and just kind of give a quick overview of it. And I think, when we talk about, what their capabilities are, we've seen them as bomb dogs, we've seen them as drug dogs. One of the things that over the last few years that had been done was there was training programs that were developed for wake detection, so that a canine would normally be trained to go to a specific target, search a car, search a room, search a couch, a package. What they had come up with was some additional training and some new techniques and processes that, as if you picture a boat going through the water and leaving a wake, someone carrying a device, an explosive device, would do basically the same thing. And the dog would be able to get from that the scent, the minor scent, and work towards the package. And that's quite similar to, when we see, the big floppy-eared dogs doing the lost and found and, going out and searching, the hounds going out and searching for people, for lost children or whatever. It was based on the same sort of theory. What we're starting to see is an expansion of it. And so one of the things that had come out was micro SD cards, that they were getting the dogs trained on being able to find the micro card. And you wonder why, what would be the significance in that? Well, the significance in it is that a lot of pedophiles were keeping the images, instead of keeping it on regular hard drives on their computer or, on thumb drives. they were keeping it on these micro cards, so you can actually throw them into, you throw it on into a couch and a cushion or something, and law enforcement would come in, execute a search warrant, and wouldn't be able to find anything, wouldn't find any of the evidence. So if someone came up with the idea of, let's figure out how to do this with the dogs to be able to find the card. And then lastly, we're one of the things that they've just started working on, which is pretty fascinating, is in the medical field. And we've seen dogs that have been trained to detect cancer in patients. And now we're seeing them where they're detecting COVID. And they still got a little bit of a way to go, I think, for COVID. But it's kind of interesting that the type of deployments that you can have with a canine.
A question on the SD card, micro SD card. Are they does that electronic device actually have a scent, or they're going for the scent of the person that planted it?
No, actually, what they're going for is the device itself. But if you think about it and the similarities, right? When a bomb is put together, there are multiple components of a bomb, right? There's the housing that it's in. So if it's a pipe bomb, it's the housing that it's in. It's maybe some of the shrapnel that's inside of it. It's the electronics that are in the blasting cap. You have the explosive powder or whatever is being used as the explosive agent. Right? So you have all of these different elements that make up an improvised explosive device. What the dog is doing is the dog is scenting on a number of different scents. And what he's looking for is the explosive residue and powder compound that's within the device. So the dog's not picking up on the metal pipe. He's not picking up on the electronics of it, the blasting cap or that. What he's picking up on is the explosives. What they did in the SD card recognition was they identified compounds that were utilized to produce the SD card. And as a result of that, they identified one or two compounds that would be significant to an SD card and have the dog recognize that. So when the dog comes in, obviously, we joked about it all the time. We would say if the dog knew that he was going to work to look for a bomb, he'd never show up for work. But if you put him out and you let him go look for that one element, and that's how the SD card works.
So how long does it typically take to train a dog for the most common usage, which is bomb detection? And would it be a similar timeline, for some of these other applications?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, in general, yes, it's pretty much the same. What winds up happening with them is, they go through a number of stages, and I think we'll get into that in a little bit. But as far as the time frame on it, how they get the indoctrination of it is over a slow period of time. You have to, you got to start small and work your way up. And so it takes a couple of months for them to get sensitized to it. But, as one of the trainers told me one time, we were talking about, how do you get them identified to a scent? And he said, listen, the reality of life is we can train them to find the Hershey Kiss. It all depends on what you want to train them to find. And so it's just that identifying that one specific scent that you want, and then having them work on that and become receptive or reactionary to the identification of it.
So typically the dogs would be specialists. If you're going for bomb detection, you've got dogs that are trained just for that. If you're going for COVID detection, they'd be trained just for that. If they're looking for the SD cards, but you're really not going to have, a utility infielder dog, that's going to be effective, highly effective on multiple scents.
Well, so if you have a tracking dog, you can sort of cross use. I mean, when we never wanted dogs that were really cross trained, right? We never would utilize a bomb dog and a drug dog, and there was a specific reason for that. But getting a dog trained to something that from a tracking to to identification of like a bomb wouldn't be that bad. Where you really run into problems is when you take the dog. Bomb dogs are trained that when they identify a scent, they recognize a scent, they sit. There has been some work where the dog will actually sort of point his nose into the specific area that he thinks that the strongest odor is coming from. So if you're looking at, a bookshelf, and he's on the third shelf and that's where the device is, you would find it on the third shelf or nose towards it. With drug dogs, they're trained to react differently. They're trained to start pouring at it and try and rip it apart and dig it out. And that becomes really problematic, right? If you have a device, you have an explosive device, the last thing you want to do is the last thing you want to have done is have the dog start smacking it all over the place.
Right. So what's the useful work life of these dogs typically? I mean, at what age, can they really be put to task, and how many years, before retirement?
You figure the dog gets about, a year and a half before he's maybe a little bit older, depending on what stage you get him and when you start training him. So you get him out and you get all of his training accomplished, and that takes months. And eventually you get him out. But, it all depends on the dog. Figure, the average shelf life is, 6-7 years. Some dogs just have an incredibly high, work drive and want to keep going and remain healthy. They don't run into the conditions that, some of the larger dogs do, like with dysplasia and hip dysplasia and issues like that. So as long as you got the dog that is healthy and wants to go. We had the Canines running. We had one particular dog that would be really excited about going. And then he was getting on in years, and we realized he was slowing down a little, so we pull him off and kind of give him a day off. And he'd feel a little left out when he was he kind of mope all day if he was left out and not working. And then after a few months and time went on, it got to a point where they just like humans, they tell you when you're ready to retire, when you're going to retire, you wake up and you go, that's it, I've had it. He woke up one day, looked up and just, come on, you ready to go? And he just put his head down and like, nah, I ain't moving. I'm here. And he just kind of told you. So somewhere between, 6-7 years, sometimes 8 years is where you get effective time out of them.
And in that working span, do you keep them sharper by keeping them in a controlled, kennel where they're not getting, distracted with other kinds of social activities? Or is it, can they actually live in a home?
You can actually keep them in working with the handler. It's critical that the dog has a relationship with the handler, because think about what we're doing. You're out looking for explosive devices. And so there's no such thing as, I had a bad day, I missed one. All right. They got to be on their game all the time. And so you want the dog to be able to react and, cared for and, friendly and happy, and he's with the handler. You want the handler to know that the dog, right? You want that. So when the handler knows that the dog, just as the dog knows the handler's having a bad day, handler knows the dog's having a bad day. It's this really weird relationship that develops between the two of them. And that only happens from over a period of time. So right. having the dog at home and becoming the family pet poses a whole lot of other issues that wind up popping up. And, at some point they become the family pet and they forget that they're actually a working dog. Right.
Well, that's a good point. We'll take our first break here. You're listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Frary. We invite you to subscribe to this show. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, then give us a call. We would love to hear from you. So segment 2, let's get into the training, both of I guess the handler as well as the handlee.
Yeah, and when you're talking about a handler who has a dog that he's working with, and you recognize either one as anything other than a partner, boy, do they get upset. They get real cranky about that. But when it comes to the training, I always used to joke about it all the time, and I would tell my guys, anytime you just want to give me the leash, I'll take the leash and walk, and you deal with all the other bullshit that you got to deal with in running a company. And but it was always said in jest, because understanding what they had to know and the training that they had to have was critical. Some of the things that the handlers are actually have to be aware of, right, is first up, how is the device made, right? What are the components of it, right? How do those things get deployed, right? What are they, what's happening in the world that they may be running into that they should be recognizing and seeing. But then more importantly, what they really need to be on top of is understanding the facility that they're operating at, how that's running, right? So you have air handling systems are critical. If the dog is picking up on a scent, is it from that particular room? Is it something that's coming in from another, is the air vent picking it up from one location and dropping it into the facility you're in or the room that you're in? So it's sort of, important that they understand, the HVAC systems in the building, how the building is running. Is there storage of any particular chemicals that might alert? Even things as simple as, like, we've had events where it was a party and they were bringing in actors and actresses to do a show. And when we went through the backstage area, we ran through we were getting alerts. And what we realized was that it was some of the cosmetics that they were using had elements in it, some carbon or whatever was in it that would cause the dogs to alert. So we ran into those type of issues. So the handler clearly needs to have sort of a I don't want to overstate, that he needs an understanding of chemistry, but he sort of needs sort of this working knowledge of chemistry and of the facility and where he's operating in. And because that'll avoid a whole lot of problems. In the situation I was telling you, we had a situation. In that situation, the handler was quick and realized that, hey, this was an air handling system. And one of the requirements that we always had with the facilities was we would say, just before the dog would do the search, shut the AC off so that there is no air moving around that would cause that. Unfortunately, on that day, that never just got transmitted to the engineering department. We had to get to the engineers. We had to stop that. And then we were able to go through and eventually clear the room. But yeah, the handler's got to go through a whole lot of training. And just as the canine goes through, the scent training, but first and foremost, he has to go through obedience training.
That's actually enlightening for me. I kind of, looked at the handler as being, the one that has the personal relationship with the dog, controls the dog. But in many ways, I guess the handler has the dog's back, right? He's got to kind of guide him. He's got to pre-screen what's going on. He's got to anticipate and maybe do some testing to see if either accidentally or intentionally some of those chemicals or cosmetics or whatnot, were planted in order to inhibit, the use of, of dogs for detection. So.
Yeah. If you have a firm that takes it serious, that is not just, grabbing law enforcement guys that are looking for part-time work and grabbing them and saying, okay, you're a handler now, handing them a leash and a couple of plastic bags to pick up any of, the left behinds that the dog might leave. You're really doing yourself a disservice. You really want to understand, what all of that is and what should go into it. And when you see it working right, I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mentioned it earlier, the dog, the handler needs to understand dog needs to understand the handler. Dog's going to have different reactions. And, sometimes it'll be, okay, maybe. Sometimes it's not. Give you an example. We had one of the dogs, or the type of dog that we hadn't mentioned earlier, it was a cadaver dog. And the cadaver dog is a dog that is trained to find buried bodies. And I was working a homicide case, and we thought we had the body had been in a vehicle. And so we bring in a cadaver dog to search the vehicle. And it was years and years before I had gotten into canine, but we were talking to the handler about it, and he searches the car, and he comes back and he says, there was some interest in it. And so the dog didn't go absolutely crazy and try and dig up the body in the back of the car, but there was an indication. And I said to him, so what does this mean? If you had to get on the stand, what can you say? And he was, at that point, he thought that the dog was giving him enough of an indication. And it was a little difficult for him at first to articulate why it was, right? Because we would look at it, to put it into, terms that we're becoming familiar with. Dog sits when there's a device or a suspected device. Right? That's how the dog alerts. But with the cadaver dog, it was a little bit different. But he was able to articulate it as to, why he felt that there was a significant enough reaction that he would be able and comfortable to get on a stand and testify to say that based on a reaction of the dog, there was a body in the trunk of the car.
Right. So following up a little bit more on this training of the handler and then similarly the training of the dog, is a well-trained dog kind of out of circulation if his handler is unavailable? Is it impossible to have a fleet of handlers, for multiple dogs? So you have some contingency plan there in case you have, an incident that needs to be responded to and one or the other has to be paired with someone new?
Yeah, there were times when you would have the ability, you'd have a couple of handlers, might be familiar with them. What we saw in our experience was you would have a person who becomes a supervisor had handled the dog for a while, and then maybe the dog got handed off to another handler, or someone, a supervisor worked with the dog and then brings in a handler and they work together as a team and eventually hands the dog off. So he was somewhat familiar with that canine. So yeah, there's some sort of familiarity with that you'd want them to, to be familiar. But for the most part, you really want to keep them together. You run into those situations when, if the family's going on vacation and they're going somewhere and they can't take the dog with them. And then so the dog has to come back to the home office for a while or for the time that they're gone. You run into that every once in a while. Or if a dog gets injured in work, and that happens, that's just the nature of the business. Dog will get injured. If they're getting on escalators, sometimes cause them a problem. Their paws can get stuck and they can wind up getting cut. Or if they're jumping on and off a truck, things like that. So they get some work-related injuries along the way and they wind up getting, sidelined for a bit. So you try and get another handler familiar with another dog, but it's a slow process. It's not something that's easily interchangeable.
So one thing that needs to remain consistent is different dogs, I imagine to a degree, have different rewards that they're used to. So the handlers need to be consistent with that in order to keep the dog on his toes or paws, as the case may be.
Yeah. They, it's kind of funny. I mean, just like you got, personalities, right? Within a company, you got people that just don't get along, right? There's a personality conflict, and sometimes it's because one of the two people just doesn't have a personality, so you can't have a conflict. But it's just, things just sometimes happen. And it's the same thing with the dogs. Sometimes, if you had a large enough event, you had multiple dogs out, some dogs just couldn't work with others. They just couldn't be together. And then there are other dogs that, just love being together. So you kind of run into that problem a little bit as to who can work with who and who could be around. But ultimately, the reward that happens is, some federal agencies train their dog that if they identify a scent, they use food as a reward. And we never were too excited about that because we always felt, what happens if the dog happened to be hungry that day? And he's looking for a snack. So we were never into it. What we always liked doing, and what all of the ones that we had were deployed with, was play. You had a tennis ball, or you had an old piece of fire hose, something that they could play with. And if they would go out and it was playtime, they would go out and they would search. And when they realized what was there or recognized what was there, the handler would take the ball and throw it, or throw the hose down, or play tug of war or something along those lines. And that was the reward that they always reacted to. And it was ultimately, it was play for them. It was fun.
Right. Well, that's a good point. Take our second break. You are listening to the riskadvisor.com podcast, hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Frary. We invite you to subscribe to the show. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event, or would like to consult with us, then please give us a call. We would love to hear from you. Segment 3, considerations to hire. And, what vetting, what's the grading system here? What somebody that believes they have a need, how can they be assured with the level of sophistication and investment that goes into the training of the handler and the training of the dog to get a good one, a good pairing? This is not an inexpensive adventure. So there's a lot of opportunity for somebody that's providing a C or a D level of service to make a lot of money. And unfortunately, if they're not accurate, things don't go well.
Oops. I always said, we never had the ability to have an oops. You bring the dog in, doesn't alert to something, and all of a sudden, kabang, and oops, missed that one. Yeah, it's somewhat problematic. When we look at, and I guess that was one of the reasons why we really wanted to do this show, was to talk about the dogs and talk about if you're going to hire, what are those things that you really need to consider. And I guess one of them, is that fear. Fear is not true, and what I mean by that is there was a lot of reluctance by properties to put dogs out. And the fear there was that tenants or occupants of the building were going to say, oh my God, we got a bomb dog here. This is, they're afraid we're going to have bombs. I don't want to be anywhere near this. And that's, that is really a non-starter. We've never run into it. I've never seen that, where in essence, in reality, everything I've seen is totally different. It's completely 180 from that. People aren't going to move out because you have a bomb dog. What they're going to do is just feel way more secure. And that's something that, in the very beginning, we had a fight. And then as time wore on, we wound up with other problems.
Right. So, the dog is not only effective in what he finds, or she, but as a deterrent. So if you really have a relatively high target-rich situation, are you really taking a big risk going part-time rather than a steady routine of a full-time application for whether it's package screening or scanning the facilities or whatnot? Because perpetrators are scoping you out, and if they see that inconsistency, they know where their windows of opportunity can be.
Well, this is probably where our two worlds merge, right? Because we run into the same issue, right? On the canine side, you're looking at budget, right? It always comes down to the numbers, right? Regardless of what anybody says, it's not about the money. Well, it's always about the money. And so what you wind up doing, right, is you look at how much risk you got and how much money you got, and you start spending the money and you bring the risk down, and somewhere along the line, everything levels off, right? You just don't have any more money, and you just got to live with the risk that you got. Same thing, and I'm sure you've seen this zillions of times, right? You're looking to deploy a system that would be incredibly beneficial, but they just don't have the money to it. In the electronic side, you can try and put a 5-year plan together, and you could budget along the way. Similarly, with the canine operation, you could do a similar thing and we were pretty effective with it. where you would put them out X number of hours. You'd work into the budget how many hours you can really afford to have the dog, and whether it's 5 hours a week, 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week, whatever that amount was. And the way we would deploy them was we didn't have them. So if they got 10 hours a week, we didn't deploy them, 10 hours for one day and leave. What we would do is we would split that over 3-4 days. And it was never, coming in at 8 o'clock in the morning and leaving at 10, or leaving at 11. We'd stagger the hours, stagger the time. So you're absolutely right. You're being watched. You're trying to throw a head fake to somebody. That you're trying to play that cat and mouse game with them. But obviously, if you can afford full time, full time is the best. But it's incredibly expensive when you start looking at that, and it's tough to justify those numbers.
Right. You mentioned that there's a effectiveness can be interfered with certain chemicals or cosmetics or whatever. Is weather also a variable that affects the accuracy of the dog?
Weather doesn't affect the accuracy of the dog, but you wind up running into situations where things that you would normally not think about. In the summer, when you get an excessive heat and you have the dog out on a street, the blacktop, the concrete can get incredibly hot. So much so that if the dog is on it for a period of time, it can burn the paws. So you have to be very, again, this is the handler, right? There's things that the handler has to know, right? What are the temperature ranges that we're operating in? Is there something that we're going to have a problem where we're going to have to take them off the concrete, off the blacktop? Similarly, in the cold weather, right? When you have ice and snow, and you start putting out these chemicals, these ice melts, or you put out the rock salt to melt the ice, you wind up you can cause irritations in the dog's paws, and sometimes you'll see them walking around with little booties on. That's because the dogs can sometimes have bad reactions to that. So you want to get them, as comfortable as possible because you don't want them distracted. But that's pretty much how that all works. So it's environmental more than anything.
Right. Where dogs are, become part of the backdrop, and buildings or tenants become quite accustomed to them, and you got some people that are just dog people. Does that really have to be discouraged, for them wanting to, give the dog treats and what have you? Does that have a, do you kind of have to put some cold water on that with that activity?
Yeah. So, so all of the dogs that we would get, we always wanted to ensure that they had a high play drive, that they were incredibly friendly. We normally went for like the floppy ear dogs, the labs and that type, that were friendly and that people would want to come up to. And we would use that as as a value add, right? As a customer service, right? People are in the building, they feel good about the dog. And then all of a sudden they come over and, now they want to know more about them. So the handlers inevitably get asked the same questions, probably about 50 times a day. What's his name? And what does he smell for? And, all the whole list of things they go through. But then what they do is, the people, some of them get really friendly and actually would want to take pictures with the dog. And this is why, we would say if the dog was actively searching, then we didn't want the dog to be interrupted for obvious reasons. But if he was standing in a lobby and just having a little bit of downtime, and maybe getting into the air conditioning on a hot summer day, and people come by and they wanted to, pet the dog and, chat with the handler, we would encourage that, because we wanted them to do it. Some of them actually would want to take pictures. We actually got to a point where we had 8x10 glossies made up of each dog. And we would actually, people wanted pictures of the dog. We would say, look, give us your name and your number and we'll send you a picture of them. And they, give us their contact info. And what we would do is we would send them an 8x10 and it would say, I'm happy to be here to protect you. And, whatever the dog's name, Rover. And then we'd had a paw print that we actually put on it. And people just absolutely went crazy for that. They loved that. The treats was another thing that we had to get we had to cut down on that. We had to stop and cut down. We had to stop that. And there were actually two reasons behind it. One, the dogs got incredibly, familiar with the people that were bringing them treats. And all of a sudden, it became a distraction. And then the dogs starting to get treats, and we control their diets very closely, right? Because you want to keep them as healthy as possible, so you don't want somebody handing them a chocolate bar. But the flip side of that, and we get paid to be neurotic, right? It's a good way to poison the dog. If we would allow the general public to come up and give the dog a treat, you don't know what that dog is getting and how that dog's going to react. And even if it wasn't an intentional poisoning, it could be something that the dogs, and they're all just like us. I mean, they're all individuals, and there are things that either they're allergic to or that have different reactions on them. And again, if it starts taking them out of line, offline, it's a problem. From a business side of it, making any money.
Well, with both the dogs and the handlers being in such short supply, and if they are, dedicated to, a certain, site or list of sites, does their retraining include that occurring when they're in service at those sites? Is that actually helpful in the environment that they know to keep them sharp and actually, in some cases, be planting things for them to discover, which is also, I think, reassuring for the owner and the tenants, seeing that effectiveness demonstrated that way.
Yeah, we actually, the handlers all carried what was called hides, and it was simulated explosives. And the dogs were, the handler would go and put a hide out in a room, maybe in a desk drawer or something, and then bring the dog in and have the dog do a search. And the dog would ultimately find it and would get the reward and would get the playtime. It was important that you had them do that. It's sort of a sad story in a way. Right after 9/11, there were a bunch of cadaver dogs were brought in to find some of the bodies that were buried. And they were having difficulty in the very beginning because they weren't being able to get deep enough, weren't able to find anything. And what was happening was the dogs were actually becoming depressed because they weren't making a find. So similarly, we run into the same situation where you can't work a dog 8 hours a day and not have him get to play. So, fortunately, you don't run into improvised explosive devices every single day. So what you wind up doing is you put the hides out, and it serves a couple of purposes, right? The first of which is to make sure that the dog is, still scented and, is up on his game. Two, that it becomes part of, the ritual for the dog so that he's finding something and he's getting that play and he stays motivated.
Wow. Well, this is, I tell you, this is refreshing and reassuring to know that at least we do have one, tools of the trade here for security that is immune from cyber attacks and from big tech turning it on. We've done a series of shows here now where we talk about all of these risks to these great new electronic tools that we have, and lo and behold, something, this simple. It's just refreshing to know that we have at least we're immune from those two risks, with the use of canine detection, and hopefully we can attain that, with some of the electronic tools we have as well. So, anything else to add before we close?
I think if you're looking at a company and you're going to want to identify what their program is and how well they could work, give us a call. We'd be more than happy to chat with you about that and run you through some of the things that the good, the bad, the ugly. There are a lot of fakers out there, and that's a major problem. We joke about it all the time that some guy wants to get into the industry and he goes out to the pound and gets a pound puppy and puts a leash on him and puts a vest on and goes, I got a bomb dog. Do the due diligence and talk to a number of people. Give us a call. We're more than happy to talk to you about it.
And references are like anything else, very, very important.
Critical, yeah.
All righty. You have been listening to the riskadvisor.com podcast, hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Frary. We invite you to subscribe to this show. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, then give us a call. We'd love to hear from you. Remember, you can hear the show on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube, and of course, stream it at theriskadvisor.com. Thank you again for listening, and we hope you tune in again next week.
Now more than ever, it's critical that customers find accurate information about your business. Local Works by Yahoo Small Business makes it easy to add, edit, and publish business information across 70-plus local directories from a single dashboard. Ensure your business is found with Local Works and save 10% today by using code LWPodcast. Visit yahoosmallbusiness.com/local to find out more. Now more than ever, it's critical that customers find accurate information about your business. Local Works by Yahoo Small Business makes it easy to add, edit, and publish business information across 70-plus local directories from a single dashboard. Ensure your business is found with Local Works and save 10% today by using code LWPodcast. Visit yahoosmallbusiness.com/local to find out more. More.